Good evening, everybody. My name is Brian Marita, and tonight I will be refuting Jack Davidson's topic on industrial hemp, in which he claimed, or his claim was, federal legalization of industrial hemp will have positive impacts on America's agricultural economy. And his three secondary claims were hemp products would easily replace more difficult to produce substitutes. Hemp is great for the environment and great for the soil. And many of the struggling small-scale farmers will find new products to produce and sell. To refute his first secondary claim, hemp products would easily replace more difficult to produce substitutes, he mentions that hemp can easily replace cotton. Through my research, and according to a source known as slate.com, it states how producing organic hemp actually uses more energy to produce than organic cotton, which makes it easier to produce. Which makes it harder to produce metal. Also in his secondary claim, he mentions how it is a viable alternative to fossil fuels, and it's used as biofuel, both the seed and the stalk can be used to create biofuel, and that textiles, plastics, and other materials can be made from using hemp. But throughout my research, I also researched how hemp clothing and organic clothing isn't treated with the same chemicals as cotton clothing is, which can eventually lead to breaks and easier wearing out than regular cotton clothing. And also, organic clothing tends to be a lot more expensive than regular cotton clothing that you would find at most retail stores. Now, his secondary claim, hemp is great for the environment and great for the soil. Within the secondary claim, he provided evidence in which it did prove how industrial hemp is great for the soil, but it does not have any source or any evidence how it is great for the environment. And throughout my research, in order to refute this claim, I learned, according to hempethics.com, that the use of industrial hemp produces CO2, and this was not mentioned in his secondary claim. In his third claim, many of the struggling small-scale farmers will find a new product to produce and sell. And mentioned in his third claim that hemp is a great sustainable alternative to both cotton crops and tree farms, and that demand for hemp will only increase. My refute to this is that because hemp tends to pollinate a lot more than most other plants, that it could reach other crops that these small-scale farmers are growing, and that it can affect other crops these farmers are growing and other farmers as well. And according to the Paradise Post, it says that there's also a lot more money in medicinal marijuana than in industrial hemp. So these struggling small-scale farmers will, in long term, will receive a bit more of income than they previously did when they were struggling. But in comparison to the market of medicinal marijuana, they would not receive as much as they would want. So in conclusion, I hope you will all agree with me that the federal legalization of industrial hemp will not carry the positive impacts as much as it is stated to be. Thank you.
All right, Brian, the main proposition secondary claims are labeled. I do have a piece of advice for you when you're speaking to us. You need to look up a little bit more and you need to speak up a little bit more because it sometimes is a little hard to hear you. The first point is signposted pretty clearly. The issue of cotton is challenged. You challenge the lack of data that the advocate presents. Your data is, though, I think also a little bit vague, and I think that you need to provide some source on this. there's a kind of this general rule about how it's going to be more environmentally harmful, and you mentioned some biofuel issues that are coming up also, and I think that there's not any quantitative data here. I never heard any response to the evidence that the advocate used, so most of this is just counterclaim stuff, and some of the counterclaims don't really have much data to them. The idea that the hemp-based clothing, for instance, is more subject to wear and tear or has other kinds of problems, or that you have to use different chemicals for this purpose, that is harmful, dangerous, or expensive, none of that's quantified, and there's not really any source citation on this. I don't know how the hemp clothing or the cloth or the materials can get made, how it can be refined, how soft or harsh it can be. When I think of hemp, I'm thinking of a burlap bag, and I'm sure that people don't want to wear clothes that feel like a burlap bag, but maybe that's not what's going on here. So I think that there's just not enough exploration of what the advocate's original argument was, and although you found a couple of issues that might be responses, there's no data on this particular point. On the environmental issue, basically you challenge the advocate again for their environmental leak. You say there's not really much evidence there, but that's about as far as you go. You don't tell us what's problematic about the evidence that they present, and then you basically say, anyway, producing this produces CO2, which is like, okay, almost all living things produce some kind of CO2, so why is that a bad thing? And I'm not positive about this, but it seems to me that most plant life consumes more CO2 than it produces, and so that sounds like it would be a net benefit. I don't know, and you don't really have any data on this point either. So it's a very vague response on that particular point. On the third point, the pollination issue it's suggested, but again, there's no data. How big a problem would this be? Why is it something that we should be worried about? The other argument, I think, is maybe a little bit more practical, but you need to take an extra step to make it a useful argument, and that is that the likelihood is that people who started with industrial hemp would end up having to move to a different marketplace in order to survive. So industrial hemp is not really an economically feasible, I don't know what you would call it, financial plan or business plan for them, since they could just as easily produce hemp for the purpose of producing medicinal marijuana, and then we wouldn't get all of those other benefits that are being talked about here. Maybe that's the way you ought to be going with that argument. All right, it's mostly counterclaim. I think you need to be a little bit more direct in arguing that the advocate didn't reason well as well. All right, thank you.